Welcome to The Real Thomas Jefferson, episode 22. And today we are going to talk about Thomas Jefferson and the real Patrick Henry.
Yeah, there's another Patrick Henry. People don't know about him. You didn't know about him either, did you?
No, I didn't, and I'm wondering why I didn't, but I think I know why.
We'll find out.
We'll talk about that more and when we get into the subject, into our topic. But first, I want to talk about the aim of the show, the real Thomas Jefferson.
With Colonel Holowchak and Colonel Jeffy Jackson here, my dog.
Oh,
he wants to be a colonel too, so he's gonna have to be a colonel, I guess, right,
we'll
Jeff?
make him an honorary colonel.
He's a real colonel.
Okay, since the publication of Merrill D. Peterson's groundbreaking manuscript, The Jefferson Image in the American Mind, nearly all Jeffersonian biographers take it upon themselves to write of Jefferson's protean nature or Janus-facedness. What Jefferson says most often cannot be understood literally. His prose must then be deconstructed, and so intuitiveness and knack are needed in preference to logical acumen. One scholar who spent a career writing on Jefferson said that Jefferson simply cannot be known. It is commonplace, and we'll have to argue with that, it is commonplace to call the man a contradiction, as if a person can have the property of a necessarily false sentence. This show, The Real Thomas Jefferson, aims to dispel that myth. Jefferson can be known, and logic, not intuitive, and discretionary deconstruction is the method, along with a beard manager.
Along with a beard manager, right? Good for I'm glad you said that. So we are going to talk about this other Thomas Jefferson. This is the other Patrick Henry, excuse me. Yeah. And there's another Thomas Jefferson here sitting on my desk while I'm talking. My dog. By the way, he found two young female friends here, young girls that came over to walk him yesterday. The one ran with him through the street, so he's really happy to make some friends in Flint, and he's ecstatic that he's getting so much attention. He likes attention, so I don't know.
So is he getting more attention from the ladies than you are?
Absolutely, of course. Why wouldn't he?
He's cuter, that's why.
Better looking than I am. Of course, he's going to get more attention.
He is adorable.
But anyways, what if I start with saying something about Jefferson and the Natural Bridge, and you chime in and ask questions that viewers might have or you have. Okay. And the year Jefferson wrote Summary View of Jefferson wants to go down. Summary View of the Rights of British America. Excuse me, I'm trying to get Jeffy down. He also purchases, that's 1774, he purchases the Natural Bridge. The Natural Bridge is I'll give you a screen share here. So you can see this. You can see the plot here. There's a natural picture of the natural bridge.
Yeah, so you're recording from the Natural Bridge right now. I can see it behind you.
Yeah, so actually behind me, of course, here's another picture of it on the slideshow. I just want to show you a couple things. This picture I actually took. I'm not very good photographer. Photography needs a keen aesthetic eye, which I presumably don't possess. But this is the tract of land. So he buys this 157-acre tract of land, and you can see by the lines at the top and at the bottom, it's a very strange, thin, long, and seemingly going off in all directions. And it's the land on which the Natural Bridge sits. And the line on the bottom is presumably Cedar Creek, I assume, and the Natural Bridge is somewhere along the creek, over the creek. I'm not going to cover just what all this stuff means, but that's enough to get us started for the time being. And let's see. Yeah, so I mean, so he buys this at the same year that he writes his Summary Review of the Rights of British America. And, you know, of course, that really pisses off the King of England, right? And George III. And of course, they don't. So he buys it for a pittance because the land's really not worth anything. It's not worth much of anything. And, so hence it's a cheap acquisition. And Jefferson he'll visit it. He visits it prior to 1774 before he buys it, obviously. And he must have heard a lot about this from his father, right? You remember what his father did, among other things? He was a surveyor.
Oh, okay.
So Jefferson learned a lot about surveying from his father, and he knew a lot about land because of his father. Father had surveying instruments, and he went with Joshua Fry. He was a very important figure
Oh,
in early Virginia, Jefferson's father. And so he purchases it for a pittance, and he must have heard his father must have seen it a number of times while he's surveying, land in Virginia and so forth, and must have heard remarkable stories and been, really dying to see this. And at some point prior to 1774, after the death of his father, Peter, he pays it a visit. And when he has the opportunity to buy it in 1774 for nothing, he's buying the land, he buys it. I'll say one thing about the worth of the land. When Jefferson is massively in debt as president of the United States, he tries to sell it, and he's told that the price is he's given a price, and that price is like worth 1/10 of what his brother Randolph Jefferson's land is worth. It's because it's just
oh,
pretty much worthless land and highly inaccessible.
oh.
The only redeeming feature is it has this remarkable natural structure, this mirabile visu called the natural bridge. So that's what, some of the background in terms of why he bought it and so forth.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that makes a lot of sense thinking about his father as a surveyor and his love for this piece of land. So he couldn't sell it.
Well, he wanted to sell it at some point. He never really wanted to sell it, but he wanted because of the natural bridge. He was always afraid of. I used the term, and I have a book coming out on this, as you know. It's called Thomas Jefferson, Guardian of the Natural Bridge. And I just worked on the page proof, and there's no index for it. So I worked on the page proofs. It's not a very long book. It need not be a long book. It's one of my shorter ones. And Jefferson was always worried about defacing and masking. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, at the time, did you ever go to a hot spring in their life and sit in hot spring water, natural hot spring water outside somewhere?
No.
I have on several occasions. That was very popular in Jefferson's day. These sort of hot mineral springs were thought to revivify the body, cure arthritis, and cure everything.
Oh,
Jefferson went in France, the south of France, to these celebrated mineral spring baths and so forth. And all that he got out of that was diarrhea. And
oh,
he was very soured on. He was very hopeful because he broke his wrist, right, when he was trying to impress Maria Cosway. And he was always hoping that there'd be some way of healing it. Probably didn't know the extent to which the wrist was screwed up. But, these things were advertised to cure everything. And if you're going to go on a weekend to a bubbling hot springs area, George Washington went to one. He had a tub at one place, actually. Years ago, I wrote on this. But what are you going to do? If you go see the natural bridge, you can see back of me, it's quite remarkable, okay. But what are you going to do while you're there?
take pictures.
How long is the thrill going to last?
Right. Not long.
No, you're going to say this is remarkable. There's a nice walking path. You get to see the creek that formed it. So, there is a resort. When Jefferson talked about defacing and masking, he meant building it up. He meant putting buildings around the bridge, inviting tourists, having all sorts of events in which tourists could engage,
Oh,
to have fun around it. He hated it. And that's what goes on right now at the Natural Bridge. You have, you can see the bridge, and there are all sorts of events. You can get married there. And in the history of it, they had all sorts of things. They had an elevator that went up, and down the bridge and so forth. And he hated that for the reason may not be obvious, but it is to me, having read Plato, because when nature creates something, any attempt to recreate it is going to be second fiddle.
Right. Right.
So, I mean, you go there, you see the bridge, it's remarkable. It's a sublime object. It takes your breath away. And then at some point you're done with that. So there are all sorts of other things you can do, in which case you are defacing and masking. And at some point, the bridge becomes of secondary importance.
Right. Right.
And he didn't want that.
So who is this other Patrick Henry that we've never heard of? Who is this man?
Well, there's a lot to say here, and I'm not going to say everything. He was a former slave. J. Lee Davis, who wrote a book called something like Bits of History and Legends Around the Natural Bridge. It was written around 1950, 1949 to be exact, if I remember. And, he says this was one of Jefferson's trusted slaves. And Henry was not one of Jefferson's slaves. It's a lazy man's way of doing history. But he was a free black man, and he will come to occupy the natural bridge. Before I get into Henry,
but he was a former slave.
He was a former slave,
right?
Yeah.
He was okay,
and he marries a slave, and then he frees the slave upon marriage. And there's also confusion by J. Lee Davis in terms of how that works and everything. But I should say there are a couple other people before we get to Patrick Henry. Dr. Philip Thornton, who rents out. Jefferson is not inclined to monetize on the bridge, but it is a financial drain. And as president, he earns $25,000 a year as president, but after his 4 years, he winds up being $10,000 more in debt. So he made $200,000 in his tenure as president, and after that, he spent $210,000. So
yeah,
he wasn't very fiscally responsible. You'd think 25,000 back there you could easily manage, but old Thomas had his dinners where you had Republicans and Federalists go at different times, and
right.
it was clever. So Philip Thornton rented it out for time, and then he had another person whose name I'll try to find, William Carruthers. Carruthers would sort of oversee the land in Jefferson. He would sort of rent out the area right around the natural bridge because it was rich in saltpeter and it was rich in lead. Okay. So why is that important? Let me bring up another share screen here, and I could show you what. Here is the saltpeter cave a picture I took. So okay. In there. It's sort of dark. You can go in there and take a look at it. Here is the next is Cedar Creek. Excuse me, I went too fast, too far. Let me make this large.
Oh wow!
Picture of the creek that goes under the bridge. Now the creek probably was, an underground stream, and through years and years and years of going underground, maybe one theory is that it met with resistance from rock, and it actually blew through the rock and created this natural bridge. In that time, there's massive erosion of the underground stream of the rock around it, and the bridge is what is left of the formation. So Jefferson and other people knew that the bridge itself would in time, implode. But this is the creek. It's not a very massive, you can see what a small creek it was and yet what damage it could do. Now, we talked about lead. This is something I didn't know a lot about till I wrote the book. Why was the natural bridge, let's go back to the picture of that, important for, you can see here, if you see my arrow, at the top of the bridge, which is 100 feet high, the creek runs underneath it.
Right.
So why is that interesting for making lead? Right. Let's look at the picture on the left. The way you made, little pellets for your guns, for your muskets and so forth in his day, is that you would boil lead. And then at the top, you see right molten lead, you boil it, then put it through a sieve of sorts, a perforated pan, a pan with holes in it, right?
Okay.
And the lead would get through the holes, and a certain amount of it would pour through every hole before it would break, and it would fall down, as you see, into a big pond of water.
Oh, okay.
Have
Okay.
these little pellets that are molten and hot falling into the water where they cool and they become little, musket balls,
Okay.
right? And so if you go back to the natural bridge, if you go right on top of the bridge here, you can use the bridge. You don't have to build a tower. Look at this tower in Baltimore. It's funny, you travel in cities
Right.
and times and you see all these things and you just think, oh, tower for grain or something, right? This is a shot tower. This is for making lead and musket balls and stuff.
Wow.
And you see this oftentimes in these old towns, and people don't know what they are at all. They know nothing about this. And I didn't know much about this at all. But it's kind of a cool thing. So being able to go back to the first picture, you can stand on top of the bridge, have the sieve around the bridge, and drop the balls into Cedar Creek. If you stop up the creek somewhere by putting stones across it,
Right.
you'd flood it to a certain extent and have that sort of pond. So Jefferson allowed these people to do just that. Let me see if there's anything else I want to show. No. Okay, I can close that up for now. So you get the idea that this was important at the time for that purpose. And so, William Carruthers is using it for that purpose. And, he wants to monetize on that. And the key event at the time is, it goes without saying, the War of 1812.
Okay.
Why is that important? Well, you need musket balls.
Right.
You can make a lot of money. So, with the war, Carruthers and, Thornton are sort of excited. Of course, they don't want to lose the war against Britain, but they want the war to go on so they can make money. People that are making musket balls and things like that, shot, don't want to see the war end, because the longer it goes, the more money they make. Me, I say plant flowers, not make musket balls. Anyway, I'm just teasing.
I know. Speaking of flowers, I really like your shirt. That's very, very nice.
Yes, I like it too.
It was a nice shirt to wear to the natural bridge.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
I just have to be careful I don't get sunstroke, because the sun is shining brightly back.
So
And
now, so Patrick Henry, okay, he was a former slave, now a free man.
well,
And
I didn't enter. Let me just say a couple more things here. Now, Carruthers is a shady character. Jefferson never has an overseer. And this is a long haul to get to the natural bridge from Monticello. It's ridiculous. It's
okay,
accessible from Poplar Forest. One has to go on a northerly path, cross over the James River. It's not mileage-wise extraordinarily far.
okay.
It is far. It's 20 miles. I don't remember how many miles, but it's some distance. But there's no easy path to take.
Hmm.
And in fact, when you get close, you cross the James, you go to Greenlee's Ferry and so forth. The path you have to take is rather anfractuous, and you need a tour guide, someone who lives in the area, can take. Jefferson has to pay someone when he visits to take him or his family members, his friends, to the natural bridge, because there's no, what do I want to say? There's no beaten down path. People are not flooding to see it. Very few people know about it. In fact, let me say this, and I say this in my book. Jefferson, when he writes about the natural bridge in his Notes on Virginia, which gets published in English in 1787 while he's in France, is the largest spokesperson ever for the bridge. And people from Virginia and people from all over the world actually flood to see the bridge because of Jefferson writing about it. And at some point, Jefferson builds a cottage on it. Now Jefferson only sees, I didn't say how many times. He sees it prior to buying it in 1774. He sees it in 1781 when the British Dragoons, he's governor, and they chase him out of Charlottesville, and he takes his family back to Poplar Forest. He sees it in 1781 of that year. Then he doesn't visit it from 1781 all the way till 1815.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that's what, 20, 35 years or so. I mean, he's busy. It's a long truck. He loves a natural bridge, doesn't want to see anybody deface it or mask it. And then he visits again in 1817. These are years of retirement. And then lastly in 1821, just 5 years prior to his death. So only visits it 5 times, but he doesn't want to sell it. He has an opportunity to sell it during his presidency. He considers it and he says, okay, then later on, the person never closes on it. Someone else asks to buy it. He changes his mind. So I'm not selling it. He's worried about defacing and masking.
Right.
Now we get to Patrick Henry.
Yeah, how does he fit into all of this?
Well, this is a show about him, isn't it? Yeah. But what I want to say, these other people are very, very important because it is Carruthers, right, who was mining it, who introduces Jefferson to this guy named Patrick Henry, this free black, on June 2, 1817. So here enters Patrick Henry. Now, Patrick Henry very, very likely can't write, probably can't read. Why do I say that? Because there's no correspondence between him and Jefferson. And anytime Henry communicates with Jefferson, it's always through a medium, someone. Okay, so Carruthers writes to Jefferson. Carruthers won't live much longer. He says, Patrick Henry, a free man of Coular, should be color, Coular, requested me to write you that he will rent what land is cultivatable on the bridge tract, which is perhaps about 10 acres, all of which is to clear off and enclose, for which he is willing to pay a fair value. Patrick is a man of good behavior, and as the neighbors are destroying your timber very much, it might not be amiss to authorize him to take care of it, in order to which it might be well to have the lines run by the surveyor of the county. This telling you a few things. Jefferson does not go to his 157 tract of land very often. So his neighbors are defacing. They're cutting down trees. One neighbor in particular, I go into this in my book, I won't here, is cutting down his trees and using it for timber, because timber is very, use it to heat your house at night. And the other problem with cutting down the timber is that sometimes very large trees are used for markers for identifying property lines.
Right.
They used creeks, they used rivers, they used natural oddities. When you didn't have surveying, they would use chops in trees. So if I put a chop in the tree to mark off to my property, if someone chops that tree down,
there's no mark. Yeah, there's no marker for it.
And creeks meander in time, and they wear. So, if I use that as a boundary, the boundary can change. It's not a very, very, so I mean, he's talking about Carruthers, is talking about neighbors chopping down trees. In other words, you need someone to watch, your tract of land. So he's suggesting, and Carruthers is not the most trustworthy person. I go into reasons for that in the book, but he's suggesting it wouldn't be a bad idea to have someone live on it. All he wants to buy some acres of land or rent them or whatever, 10 acres of land so he can farm it. And the idea is it's not very arable. It's not very farmable. So Henry is hoping on Jefferson's generosity to give him a really cheap price, right? So Jefferson, this was on June 2, 1817, and Jefferson replies on June 11th, rather quickly. He says, I readily consent that Patrick Henry, the free man of color, whom you recommend should live on my land at the natural bridge and cultivate the cultivatable lands on it on the sole condition of paying the taxes annually as they arise and of conditions and of preventing trespasses. So Henry Jefferson's going to let him stay on the land for free. You don't have to rent it. All have to just pay the annual taxes, which is a couple bucks. Nothing really.
And doesn't he actually give him money to pay it at some point?
Yes, he does. You're right.
Yeah.
He actually, at some point, when Henry's supposed to pay the taxes, Jefferson intervenes and says, "No, I'll pay them for you," because he's so happy with the peace of mind that he gets from Henry, squatting on the land and you know and watching it and overseeing it, and it's a very nice exchange, right? Let's see.
Well, it was nice that Patrick Henry felt comfortable approaching Thomas Jefferson to ask if he could to want to do this, to watch the land.
Yeah. Let me interject here. I talked about how many miles here. I have something. He says it's 28 miles from Poplar Forest. Like I said, it's not too bad, but it takes 8 hours.
Wow.
So 8 goes into 28. You do the math, right? It's, you know, over 3 hours, right, per mile. That's not very fast. And it gives you some idea of the difficulties. Now, Carruthers dies, right? And then Jefferson gets a response from Patrick Henry through another person called Andrew Alexander on August 4th, 1817. So this is a month, not even quite a month later, several weeks later. And through Andrew Alexander, Henry writes, "Your letter of the 11th of June to Mr. Carruthers, whose death we have to lament." So Carruthers dies in the meantime. "Was received. Patrick Henry, the free man of color, is very willing to accept of your land at the Natural Bridge on the terms you propose, but he does not know the boundary and wishes you to send him a copy of the courses, etc., as he supposes trespasses have been committed."
Right.
In other words, neighbor encroaching on his land, felling his lumber, claiming, you know, if I get rid of identifying remarks, I can just say that's my land. And Jefferson is, you know, Jefferson's father was a surveyor, so Jefferson knows every trick and then some. He goes, "I inquired of the sheriff. He informed me that there are 3 years' taxes due on your land and $2.91. So it's 90 something cents a year taxes that Henry has to pay, which is a pittance. For future trespasses, if they should be made, perhaps it might be well to direct Patrick Henry how to proceed." Right? So he lets him squat on the land, right? And he's not only farming some 10 acres of the land, it's not very farmable, it's not very arable, but he can live on it. He's getting it for nothing. All he has to do is pay 90 something cents a year and then watch the land for Jefferson. Pretty good deal for Henry.
Yeah.
Right. And what is Thomas Jefferson getting in on behalf of Henry?
He's got the peace of mind that nobody's destroying the natural existence.
Excellent. Yes. Yeah, go ahead if you have more to say.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead. No,
I'm just saying he's getting peace of mind, and
right.
That you can't always put a price on that. So it's not so much a free, an equal exchange. Most people would say, if you think about it logically, that Henry's getting the better deal. But it's hard to say when you talk about who's getting better deal. Easily Henry's getting the better deal, but sometimes there's a psychological element that the Natural Bridge means so much to Thomas Jefferson, its preservation, right? Because such a remarkable thing, that the peace of mind he's getting might be an equal exchange. He might be having someone he's never had someone responsible and reliable squatting on it and communicating with Jefferson about. So it's a pretty good, right? Henry writes, Jefferson writes to Thornton with respect to Henry. He goes, "The object of the present letter is to renew the offer therein made and to add that Patrick Henry, the free man of color living there, informs me that some mischievous people lately threw your kettle over the bridge and destroyed it. The kettle was probably from molten lead.
Right.
It's going to be poured through the sieve. He says the canvas tube is entirely rotten, but that the rope is worth something. So he's talking to Thornton, who was with Carruthers mining shot, making shot, mining molten lead and all that at the bridge. And Patrick Henry responds that all the items that they used for making shot have been destroyed by some people coming in, and he's letting Jefferson know about it. Right. So there's I tell in my book the story of how Patrick Henry earned his freedom, who owned him. I don't want to get that, but he does fall in love with a slave woman, black slave woman. And I do have something to say about Henry manumits her. He frees her, right? He pays for her. His wife-to-be is called Louisa. And I'll read the deed of manumission. He says, be it known to all to whom these presents may come that I, Patrick Henry, of the county of Rockbridge in state of Virginia, having in the year of our Lord 1815, so 1815, purchased from Benjamin Darst of the town of Lexington, Virginia, a female slave known as Louisa, and since then known by the name of Louisa Henry. Obviously, they got married. He liked Louisa. Now, for and in consideration of her extraordinary meritorious zeal in the prosecution of my interest, her constant probity and exemplary deportment subsequent to her being recognized as my wife. Obviously, he's not, it's Henry not writing this. It's a very eloquently written letter by someone who's really well-versed in the English language. Together with diverse other good and substantial reason, I have this day in open court in the county aforesaid, by this my public deed of manumission, determined to enfranchise, set free, and admit her to participation in all and every privilege, advantage, and immunity that free persons of color are capacitated, enabled, or permitted to enjoy in conformity with the laws and provisions of the Commonwealth in such cases made provided. Only could have been written by a lawyer because it's so damn verbose.
Right.
And prolix, right? And redundant, right? Given her, admit her every privilege, advantage, and immunity. Talk about redundancies. And he says, and by these presents I do emancipate, manumit, set free, and disenthrall. Don't all those things mean the same thing? Again, a lawyer that said Louisa. It's a good thing that Henry didn't write that because it's very, very redundant. Alias Louisa Henry, from the shackles of slavery and bondage forever, from myself and all persons whomsoever I do renounce, resign, and henceforth disclaim all authority over her as or in the capacity of a slave. In other words, she's never going to be a slave. She's just going to be my wife. Right. So, I mean, there's a couple more lines. It's not important. But the idea is Henry signs off on this deed of manumission. He purchases her from the owner, takes her as his wife, and Henry builds a cabin. Jefferson has a cabin, a small cabin there, in case he had built. He had a book. I didn't say anything about the book he had, but many distinguished people came to visit the natural bridge. Let me go back to the early part here. So in this little cabin that he builds, tiny cabin, in case he stays there, needs a place to stay, he has a book of all the famous people who visit. Chief Justice John Marshall signs it. Oh. Sam Houston, right? The great general, right? Patrick Henry, the other Patrick Henry, the white Patrick Henry. Andrew Jackson, Jefferson's favorite person. Henry, and even though Jackson loved Jefferson, Henry Clay, Daniel Boone, and Light Horse Harry Lee. Now, this is a sort of who's who, right? Of very famous. And of course, later on, many important people would visit the bridge, dignitaries from all over the world and so forth. But the book gets lost at some point, perhaps burnt. Yeah. So we don't have that anymore. It's really kind of a cool thing. So what happens? So Jefferson dies. Guess what happens then?
What happens?
Well, Jefferson's grandson lets Patrick and Louisa stay there.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's great.
Jefferson, uh, Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, has to sell uh, the Natural Bridge land. Obviously, when Jefferson dies, he's so massively in debt. By today's numbers, well over $1 million in debt. So his grandson has to sell, a lot of everything they own. He sells the Natural Bridge, and it comes under new ownership, and comes into the hand of someone called Captain J. Lackland. Lackland will build.
So before, because we're running out of time, we only have 3 minutes, a little over 3 minutes left. What I want to know is, this is something wonderful that Thomas Jefferson did for a Black man, and then once he was gone, even his family continued to extend that kindness. Why do we not hear about this story? Why is this the first time I'm hearing about this story?
Well, because historians don't want to say anything, because you might have to say Jefferson. Arthur Scher, who's a friend of mine, and he writes about this, that this is really an amazing thing that Jefferson would do that, right? That he would allow a Black person to rent free. That
doesn't sound like the
but why is it
racist?
It's not, but it's amazing only if Jefferson really wasn't colorblind. If Jefferson really, thought, oh, you're Black, I don't like you, then you'd have to say, well, that's really astonishing. He let a Black person. But to me, Jefferson did not care about the person's skin color when it came to the possibility of the person squatting on his land. It's just, is the person dependable, trustworthy, reliable, and honest?
Right.
And when he got every indication Henry was all those things, he really liked this guy, Henry. He didn't give a damn that he was Black.
Right.
Or they had an ex-slave for a wife. So it was a nice return. I'll go back to what I was going to say. The new owners, right, allow, when Patrick Henry dies, they allow Louisa and her kid to stay on the land.
Wow.
Right? Which is another, but they're getting something out of it at this point. I mean, one thing we can say is, I'm almost finished what I want to say. I'll put up another picture. What are they getting out of it? They're getting out of it someone who actually saw Thomas Jefferson tell stories. So that people come to the bridge after Jefferson's death, well after Jefferson's death and after Patrick Henry's death, can talk to Louisa, and this elderly Black woman could say, yeah, I knew Thomas Jefferson. He came down here. He talked with my husband. He talked with me, right? And really kind of a cool story.
Yeah.
So I'll share, if you have anything, so I'll share one last screen here.
Okay.
And here's one picture of the Natural Bridge before. This is an engraving by Thomas Swan Woodcock in 1832. Now, Eleanor Jones Harvey, who's the senior curator of Smithsonian Art Museum, thinks that there are always two people squatting. When you ever see pictures of Natural Bridge, artists will usually paint or draw people in there. Why? For perspective.
Oh, gotcha.
Without people, you don't get the perspective. Now, these give every indication of being African-American people, and Eleanor Jones Harvey thinks that this is Patrick Henry and his wife.
Right. We won't know, but yeah.
We don't know. It's so interesting.
Watching the land.
And this is what Jefferson meant. This is the Natural Bridge Hotel. That's what Jefferson meant by defacing and masking. When you build up like that, you have all sorts of other events. He didn't really like that. But then again, he couldn't monetize on the bridge, right? So,
right.
I don't know. It's a pretty cool story, right? Jefferson really was a racist.
No. Do you have your book? Can you show your book before we go?
I don't. It's not. The cover's not done yet. I just finished the page proofs.